I'm Linda Coles, and this is Tell Us a Story. Lynnaire Johnston is known as the Word Wizard. Her company of the same name works with the written word to help businesses stand out from the crowd. She is or has been at various times a copywriter, a radio announcer, newsreader, communications manager, editor, and a grant writer for not-for-profits. Her journey has taken her from her first job as a cadet reporter at Radio Hauraki through to being a senior writer for Auckland Council, a writer and editor for many publications, to now owning her own copywriting business. Along the way, she's driven brand new Jaguars for a living, raced go-karts around a Japanese racetrack, and visited the Korean Demilitarised Zone. As a writer and editor, she's interviewed prime ministers and politicians, celebrities and sportspeople, and a wide range of clever, high-achieving others. She's an avid reader, podcast listener, and of course listens to Tell Us a Story. She's a Netflix viewer, aren't we all? And a film festival goer. She makes her own compost. I do too. I'll be talking about that. She grows medieval herbs, but one of her other passions, engaging with people around the world on LinkedIn, which is where I know Lynnaire from, as well as around the traps of work. So tell us more. Hello, Lynnaire. How are you?
Hello, Linda. What a pleasure to be on your podcast. This is just a fabulous opportunity. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. We only have the best here, you know, Lynnaire.
So I understand, which was, of course, why you interviewed my husband just a couple of weeks ago.
I didn't know it was your husband then.
Small world, Linda, small world.
It's a very small world. Well, let's start with you then, Lynnaire. And you've been in radio. That's where you started. A couple of well-known stations. How on earth did you get into the radio industry?
Well, when I left school, Linda, I didn't want to be a nurse and I didn't want to be a teacher. I came from a family of teachers. I didn't want to go to university because I couldn't bear sitting in a classroom for another 3 years. And so the options were rather limited. I was quite fortunate that my mother was the high school guidance counsellor, and she had been to have a look at Wellington Polytech and came back telling me that she thought that a journalism course might be the answer to what I was going to do when I was leaving school. And so I spent my first year after high school at Wellington Polytech on their magazine journalism course, which included some radio training from the experts at Radio New Zealand. And when I left the course at the end of the year and moved to Auckland, I was fortunate enough to be able to get a job as a cadet reporter at Radio Hauraki. Now, how that came about, I have absolutely no idea. There were 150 applicants. Women were not highly favoured in those roles, or in radio roles of any kind in those days, because this was the late 70s. And so we were rather in the minority. So it was somewhat of a coup and a hell of a surprise to me to be given the job. And it was the days too when radio stations were owned privately, Linda. These days they're owned by big corporates, but in those times they had individual owners. And Radio Hauraki, of course, was the original pirate station in New Zealand. It was Radio Caroline's equivalent, of course, and had started out on the Turia ship out in the Hauraki Gulf, and it hadn't been on land terribly long by the time I joined it. So there was a fairly piratical kind of culture there, I have to admit. But I learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes, as you do when you are fairly young, and had a wonderful time. It was a great grounding in both journalism, meeting people, overcoming fears, and generally learning how the world works, because I was a fairly naive youngster, I have to say, because my mother had been at the same school as I had. I hadn't been exposed to a lot of the opportunities to perhaps explore things that other children or young teenagers had had. So when I got to Hauraki, my eyes were opened.
So was it a bit like Bridget Jones? I don't know if you remember the famous scene when she was out reporting. Did anything happen that you sort of bared all, or anything went wrong?
Bridget Jones story. Perhaps not with the same kind of pair of knickers underneath. Anyway, in those days, newsrooms each had about a dozen journalists, and there were lots of different newsrooms in each city. And so we were able to go out to various places to interview people. It wasn't done all on the phone or in press conferences, much like it is today. And so one day I arrived at work and was told by the news editor that I would be going aboard the frigate Canterbury, and it had just returned from a long stint overseas, and it was back in port now, and they wanted me to go and talk to the captain. Well, I have had very little understanding or experience with the armed forces, so off I trotted in my work clothes, which were just on that particular day happened to be a skirt and high heels. Now, fortunately, the skirt was fairly voluminous, because when I got to the frigate, I suddenly realised that how you get between decks in a frigate, or any ship for that matter, is often by very steep steps. And of course, it's very expected that the personnel who is accompanying you on these frigates goes first. So here I am following somebody down, up and down these ladders, very steep, open-sided ladders, wearing my high heels and a skirt, which really didn't make me terribly popular, I have to say, with the crew, but popular enough with the captain that he did invite me to go to a ball with him after that. So I did accomplish something, Linda.
Well, so at least the camera wasn't on you, though. It was only radio, was it?
Well, of course, that's true. Fortunately. And of course, in those days too, you went on your own to these things. You didn't have it wasn't like a television crew. You weren't a whole load of you. You were just there on your own. And so there were some scary moments when you were faced with those kind of situations too, I think, with people that massively outrank you, both in terms of their experience, life experience, and their age. There was a huge age difference, but I clearly got along well enough with the captain that he would actually make an approach to me to ask me out. Now, these days, do not think that would be at all allowed, shall I say.
Oh, I know. I was going to make a comment there, but I won't, because I'll get into trouble. So.
Okay, fair enough. It's what you don't say sometimes, Linda, that's as powerful as what you do say.
So after then Radio Hauraki, you went on to be a co-host of a breakfast show. Was that Magic FM?
It was. There was a little bit of travelling in between that, and working for other radio stations too, principally 2GB in Sydney, which I really enjoyed. But Radio Magic FM, 91 FM in Auckland at that time, and now we're into the 80s, was the number one station in town. And so it often edged out 1ZB, which was the other station. But people would often say to me that it was a very glamorous job, getting up or being on air at 6 a.m. and then having the rest of the day to yourself. What I found was I was always tired, because your sleep patterns are so disrupted. If you have to get up at 4:30 or 5 a.m, you don't have much of a social life, and that doesn't kind of lend towards being, I think, a glamorous job at all. It just really was one of the eye-openers for me, that what people perceive as something that might be a glamorous thing to do, like lots of international travel, for example, is in actual fact very hard on the old body. And I personally think that kind of shift work for working those really odd hours makes it very difficult for you and to get decent sleep patterns. And I think can last you an entire lifetime. But I certainly got to do some interesting things as co-host of a breakfast show. I remember another episode with a frigate, and I was trying to find more about it online recently, because what I find is your memory doesn't hold true. And so my picture of what went on, which was that there was an American submarine arriving in Auckland, and we were on the accompanying naval frigate. This is the radio team. And this submarine was out of the water, quite like it would be if it was just normally in a harbour. But it was travelling up Waitemata Harbour at about 20 knots, which meant there was a huge bow wave off it, and there were there was a big flotilla of protest boats, because this was in the beginning of the anti-nuclear era, when we didn't want to see nuclear ships in New Zealand So there were lots of protests on land and on water. And I remember these poor boats being thrown around as we all careered up the harbour in this frigate and the submarine at around 20 knots. Well, 20 knots doesn't sound very fast, but I can tell you what, the backwash from that kind of, two big vessels like that can be somewhat difficult for little boats that are out there just bobbing around on the water. So yes, I did enjoy that. And the other thing that I got to do was, again, the perception is different from the reality. Because radio is obviously voice only and no visual, for some reason the station decided that it would charter a small plane and it would take a couple of hosts, me and the breakfast co-host, the breakfast host, and some competition winners, and we would fly over Auckland and out into the Gulf on the night that Halley's Comet was the most visible. Mm. Well, that was a great idea, but I couldn't tell Halley's Comet from any other white dot in the sky. So here was I blithely telling the audience about how I could see Halley's Comet and it looked amazingly bright and whatever. Truth was, Linda, I couldn't see the thing at all. And no matter what people would say, look up there and it's just to the right of that and you can see that little cluster. No, I could not work out which particular one. I can tell you I have seen Halley's Comet, but I couldn't tell you which one of all those dots it was.
Well, it sounds like you had some fun working for radio then.
I certainly did. It wasn't all hard work, let me assure you. And there are lots of places or times when we went out and met people who were the listeners. And the comment I got the most, for better or for worse, was, "You do not look like you sound, Lynnaire." 100 times, Linda, you go, okay. I'm really not quite sure whether I'm going to take that as a compliment or not.
Well, I've got a friend, Kevin Knebel, if you're listening, Kevin, he always says he's got a face for radio.
I think I probably have too. And I wasn't at all sure, in fact, that when I was employed for that co-host breakfast job, that I wasn't employed simply to laugh, because that seemed to be what the role was. These days is much more, I think, equality between the groups of the women and the men who are co-hosting breakfast shows. In those days, I think I was only employed to laugh at the host's jokes, which were usually...
Right. So what did you learn being a journalist? I mean, you must have interviewed a whole heap of interesting people. Or is it more about the skill from being a journalist, or was it more that you learned things from the people that you interviewed, do you think? Where did you get the most from?
Well, I think two aspects, really. Learning how to ask questions. So the interview skills, I think, was really important. And so I tended to develop my own style, which is quite conversational, a bit like yours. I tend to ask questions and then talk to somebody when they respond. So you're getting a conversation going rather than just people asking closed questions so that people can only give you yes/no answers. And there was only one time where that really didn't work for me, and I was interviewing another broadcaster, and this person made it very difficult to kind of form any sort of rapport, because I think that's part of interviewing, as you'll know. You get establishing a rapport with the person that you're talking to, getting them talking about interesting things and teasing out those stories. And the master of that, of course, is Graham Norton. I think he's
yeah.
Doing that, and he's very funny as well. The other thing that I enjoyed about being a journalist particularly was the variety of people that I met and the kind of subjects that I had to cover. And early on in the piece, I had what was called the industrial round, which meant that I was the person who covered strikes, unions, clashes, anything to do with industrial unrest was where I was the person that had to write those stories. Mm-hmm. And so that meant I interviewed, talked with, got to know some pretty hard-bitten journalists, union people, of course, and they were a breed of their own. But then later in my life, I was interviewing women, particularly when I was writing articles for a women's business magazine, and I got to interview a wide number of successful business women. Some of them were celebrities, some of them were sports people, people. Some of them were politicians, although fewer of those. Some of them were just really clever businesswomen and had great business ideas. And so it has been the ability to meet people I would not normally run across in the course of my everyday life that I think that has given me one of the biggest pleasures in my life from that particular line of work in terms of being a journalist. But I think that people who become journalists these days, it's done very differently. There's a lot more shock journalism, and that was not something that I could ever really see myself being part of or being very good at either. I really would rather get to know people, find out the backstory, learn more about them. But the shock tactics that they employ these days, the microphone and the face thing, that really wasn't my style. Although one night I was required to go and interview the Prime Minister as he was leaving a function. And this was in the Robert Muldoon days. And I was shocked to discover that Robert Muldoon was shorter than me. Was actually looking at him over the top of my glasses. And that was the most bizarre, because he was so short, I couldn't sort of get down to his level. And I was looking at him over the top of my glasses. And he was surprisingly kind. He gets a lot of bad press, Rob Muldoon, but on this particular occasion, he was very kind. So, yes, my only close-up with the Prime Minister.
So that you sort of then moved from the frigates that you seem to be so friendly with and went into automotive industry publications.
Yeah, it's a bit of a leap, you'd have to say, wouldn't you? Again, there were some intervals in between, but I was fortunate that my uncle owned a publishing company that was working in the automotive area, and I found myself suddenly in need of a job, and he found himself in need of an editor, and so the two collided quite nicely. And it was a publication that was only sent to the motoring industry. So these are mostly car dealers, or manufacturers in those days, not anymore, of course. So anybody who has an interest in the business of selling vehicles received this publication. And I arrived on the scene just at the time of the Kobe earthquake in Japan, which I think was 1995. And so that was a fairly, which had a massive effect on the New Zealand motor industry because of the high number of used import vehicles coming from Japan at that time. And so, and still, to be fair. And so I was able to be mentored along by my uncle, who'd been in the motoring industry for quite a long time, into being somebody who was competent enough to talk to, for example, the head of Toyota New Zealand, Bob Field, and other industry heavyweights about the industry. Now, the interesting thing about the cars was that I didn't know a steering wheel from a clutch. And I was thrown into the deep end with I've been a driver since I was 15, but I probably wasn't as bad as I felt. But I was all of a sudden mixing with people who really did know this stuff when it came to cars. And I wasn't interested in the technical side of a vehicle either. I was interested in the marketing of these vehicles. But anyway, what it meant was I was able to drive fabulous cars for quite some time, because the way the motoring industry works is that they have a pool of press cars. Each company has a pool of press cars. So say it's launching a brand new car, it might bring in 5 of them, and then it sends them out to various journalists around the country who are writing about vehicles. They might have it for 3 days, they might have it for a week, they might have it for longer, and then the idea is that they write about it, hopefully favourably, in their newspaper or publication. And so as part of this, that meant I got to drive some of these fabulous cars. Not all of the very top ones, but I did have on one occasion a Jaguar XK8. Now this thing, Linda, was stunning. It was worth more than my house at the time. I owned a house in Auckland. And this thing had Harman Kardon Harman, whatever it is, absolutely fabulous speakers, about 12 of them throughout the car. The sound system was amazing. And seriously, I would have lived in that car if it had had a shower as well. It was beautiful to drive, and it was an absolute stunner. And so, but I've also driven lots of other brand new cars. My preferences were, of course, for Europeans. I particularly liked the Audis, but there were some very big flash cars, Holdens as well. But what I found really interesting was that on the days I didn't have my car, press car, I was just driving my own ordinary everyday car, nobody would turn here. But if I got behind the wheel of one of these fabulous cars, heads would turn and people would stop and look at you. And I got to the point where I really didn't like the feeling that I was, even just that small contact with people was misleading. They thought that I was the owner of that particular car, which is a reasonable assumption to make, but I wasn't. I was masquerading as somebody who was the owner of that car. And I kind of felt really uncomfortable around that after a while, which was a very odd thing. But the other thing I learned was I don't like big cars. And I feel much more comfortable in a smaller car. And I'm not talking about really, really small cars, because you tend to get pushed off the road in those, particularly where I live, because there's lots of trucks on the roads where I live. But I like the mid-range cars where you've got enough power, and it's not ostentatious. I don't like ostentatiousness in a vehicle, because even where I live, what you drive still says something about you. But in the southern parts of the country, you cannot judge a person by the car they drive. You will find the richest people in the Lower South Island have the worst cars imaginable. It's not happen in Auckland.
I know what you mean, actually. We had an Aston Martin Vanquish just for a day. That's a long story in itself, but we stopped for lunch, and because it wasn't our car, you felt really quite vulnerable that you would leave it in a car parking space, and then when you got back, it probably wasn't going to be there.
Well, it might have been damaged, or there were a mob of people around it, or yes, absolutely. And the level of fear around having a $100,000 car in your driveway or parked on the street outside your home, it's very high. And of course, it's very easy to damage them. Curb a wheel or just misjudge, because the size of each vehicle, of course, is different, and it only takes somebody to edge out of a car park not quite correctly, or for you to do it yourself, and in all kinds of trouble. But I have to say that while I might have returned one or two with the odd blemish, I did not ever try to take a car through a river and have to abandon it, as one journalist did.
Oh dear.
And so I never managed to I didn't overturn a vehicle. I didn't drive a car into a ditch. And because a lot of these journalists who've been driving a long time drive so many different cars that when you get out from one into another, you can expect the same degree of performance. And if you don't have it and you've made a tricky maneuver, you might be on the losing end because the car simply can't cope.
So is that... Sorry, I was going to say, is that how you got to be in Japan and South Korea? Was that with that job?
It was, because the other part of being a press journalist for the automotive industry is that you also get to go away and stay at all these amazing places, because when they launch a car, they have a press launch and they will take you somewhere. It might be to Millbrook Resort in Queenstown, or it might be to Hooker Lodge in Taupo. They take a whole group of people and you drive the cars either to or from the venue, have a really flash dinner, stay in a flash hotel, and then drive the cars either on further the next day, or somebody comes and they pick you up by a bus or plane and take you back to where you came from. But you get treated like royalty, like you are a superstar on these press launches. And on 2 occasions, I was invited to go on overseas trips, and one was to Japan and with Honda, and one was to Korea with Hyundai. And the Korean one was very interesting for a number of reasons, not least because I got to visit the Demilitarised Zone. And I don't know if you remember, but Bill Clinton once described it as the scariest place he'd ever been. And I can absolutely agree with you. There's something about it that's almost haunted. The buildings are very stark. There are sentries that stand at each corner of these very plain and completely unadorned military-style buildings. And these sentries have these helmets on, carry large guns, and they do not move a muscle. A bit like the Buckingham Palace, where they have the guards that don't move, but these guys are scary, really sinister. And you looked out over on this demilitarised zone over the fence to North Korea, and in the distance on the hills were these enormous, great big speakers, and these speakers were pumping out propaganda. North Korean propaganda that you could actually hear from the demilitarised zone. And these speakers went day and night. I mean, these speakers must have been 2 kilometres away, maybe even further. And you could see that that's what they were. That's how large that they were. And it was just the most odd experience. And inside the buildings, there was a sort of sense of history and of deals trying to have been done and failed. But it was the most odd place that I think I've ever visited in my life. Security was really tight. You weren't allowed to wear jeans for reasons I don't understand. Yeah. And that caused a bit of a ruckus at the hotel before we even left, because several of the journalists were not inclined to, we're in New Zealand, we tend to have our own opinions on things and do what we like. So to be told what you can and can't do, or how you can dress, didn't sit very well. But yes, it was a most unusual place to visit. And given its interest in the news in terms of what's happening between North and South Koreas and possibly the USA at the moment, that was a really interesting visit and something that has stayed with me too.
Yeah, it wouldn't be somewhere on my bucket list, I'm afraid, to go to. But I can imagine what you experience. Actually, that's what you see on movies, what you see on the news feeds. Yeah.
It's all about taking up the opportunities when they arrived under 2. I didn't know I was going to be in. Yeah. And it was a very last minute thing. I was lucky to go. Really, somebody else must have fallen out of the trip, I think. So yes, it was fascinating. I learned to drink gin on that trip too. That's another story.
So now, I mean, you've been a member of, just changing the subject slightly then, more into where you are now. You're a member of BNI, which is, what does BNI stand for those that don't know, Lynnaire?
Business Networking International, and it is an international networking group. We meet as a chapter, about 30 odd members once a week, where we pass business referrals to each other. It's been going a long time. It was invented by a guy called Dr. Ivan Meisner, who I connected to on LinkedIn yesterday, Linda. I'm thrilled to be able to tell you that. The idea is that there are these various chapters throughout the world where people get to know each other. It's based on personal relationships. There is only one person from each industry in each chapter, and so you don't have any conflict in terms of referring business to people. So the idea is to find business opportunities for the other members of your chapter. And just last week, our chapter was given an award for having $1 million worth of business between our chapters, and another chapter here in Dunedin was given one for having $2 million worth of business between chapter members in a single year. And so if you extrapolate that out over the thousands of chapters that there are worldwide, that is billions of dollars of business being done. And
you always meet around breakfast or lunch or something like that, don't you? It's quite a nice, relaxed...
It is. It's very prescribed. There's an agenda. You stick to it. Everybody knows exactly what they're going to be doing. And there are 3 sections of the meeting, and it follows a formula. And the closer you stick to that formula, the better success you have in terms of being able to get referrals and to give referrals, because it's all about what their maxim is: givers gain. So in other words, the more you give to other people, the more you will get back. And that's a pretty good way to look at life, I have to think.
Yeah, it is. And then you've got on the other side of the fence, you've got the digital way of networking. So you spend an awful lot of time on LinkedIn, which is where I know you from and met you. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. I think most people that are in business have at least a profile, even if they're not totally active. But I know you would, but I certainly encourage people to be active on LinkedIn. So is that where you get most of your clients from as well?
Both of those. A lot of my clients are word of mouth referrals, and I still think that particularly in New Zealand, that's where most referrals still come from. But just last week, I closed a deal with an organisation in Wellington who I have not met. They have not met me, and we only met on LinkedIn. And so I'm able to stand here and say, hand on heart, it works, because I think LinkedIn is the new Facebook, Linda. That's how I'm reading it. With Facebook's changes at the beginning of the year, I think there are a lot of small businesses that are struggling now to get the readership that they, or the views, if you like, that they had before. And I think LinkedIn is the professional person's Facebook. And I love it, not because all the interesting people that I meet, but also the fact that I can learn so much because people are so sharing on LinkedIn. And that probably appeals to you too, because people put up posts about really interesting material and things that you might be well outside your comfort zone or your knowledge. And it's a bit like, again, being an interviewer, because you get to read a whole load of new stuff that would never otherwise possibly cross your desk. So, and that's something about LinkedIn that I think people don't yet realise. And I'll tell you what, the LinkedIn news feed is a hell of a lot more interesting than the Facebook feed of cute puppies and kittens and animals, so at least in my feed anyway. And so I like it a lot. I spend far too much time on LinkedIn, I have to say.
I always say, to make Facebook work, it's got to be babies or bacon.
Babies or bacon, that's a really good way to look at it. And you're absolutely right. But I think there is a certain trend of people putting babies and bacon onto LinkedIn, but I think that will fade away again, because people will very quickly realise that that's not the appropriate format for those kind of things, unless, of course, you are a photographer, in which case a sunrise photo is, of course, acceptable. But generally, people do stick to the fact that it's more of a professional network, and that's what I really, really like about it too. And the fact that at the moment, what is getting the most views are text posts, and as a writer, that I fall neatly into that category. And, but it's moving more to video, which is not my category, Linda. So that is going to push me outside my comfort zone. I've done a few. Have you done a few videos on LinkedIn yet?
I have, but I prefer audio. I did a couple of videos, and I think you're so critical of yourself when you look at the video. And the other thing is, when you put in a video on LinkedIn or Facebook, and someone's viewing it on their phone, you don't know where they are when they hit play. So all of a sudden they're sat on the bus and they're listening to me droning on, or you talking about something. And are they in a hurry then to turn it off because they don't want the neighbours around them to hear it? Or do they just scroll through it? And to me then, having a video with putting the caption in underneath, you might as well just read the written word rather than read the captions. So I'm not too sure about video on LinkedIn or Facebook when it comes to that, because I know it annoys my husband because mine's on autoplay and I haven't figured out how to turn it off yet on Facebook anyway, not on LinkedIn. So we might be watching TV and I'm scrolling through Facebook and something comes on that's got a video and it automatically starts playing, and then it's in a hurry to try and turn the darn thing off. Does my head in. So who might use your services, Lynnaire?
Small to medium businesses mostly, and I do a lot of websites these days, Linda, and because it really, a bit like having a profile on LinkedIn, you do need to have a profile, you do need to have a website, and so a lot of people use me to write professional content for their web pages, or if they're updating or even starting from scratch with a website, because they recognise that it's very hard to be objective about your business if you're on the inside of it. And so they need somebody who can describe their business, particularly if it's a technical business of some kind, that can see it from the outside and can put it into the perspective of the person that they want to attract, their potential customer. And so it's quite difficult to be able to talk about it from a customer-centric point of view when it's your own business. And I find this when I try to write something about my own business. But so it could be any kind of a business. And this is where my journalism background comes in, because having talked to, interviewed and written about so many widely differing industries and companies over my life, being able to write a website for those different kinds of industries is quite simple for me. And I also, for some reason, even though I'm not great with numbers, I seem to be able to take complex material and turn it into something that people can understand and hopefully want to actually read, because there's no people who are in industries that are technical use technical jargon when they're trying to describe something. And I have no idea what that means, even less about why we want to know what that means. And so if you want people to read what you're writing, you have to reach them. You've got to put yourself in their shoes. And so I really enjoy writing websites for businesses, because it uses a whole bunch of different skills. And it means I can write about a whole load of different things, which is great because I get bored easily.
Which is probably why you spend so much time making compost in the garden.
Oh, I do.
10 bins, that's impressive. What do you do with all that compost?
Well, I have a big garden, so I need a lot of compost. And as a compost maker yourself, you will know that compost doesn't go very far. But it's an odd thing, really. I find it very relaxing to take a wheelbarrow of clippings off plants from the garden, take it down to the compost bin, podcast in ears, drink in hand, and sit there snipping pieces of greenery into smaller pieces and layering them in my compost bins. It's kind of like you're growing something that's organic, and it's the closest thing I can think of to actually making soil for the garden, because I'm a bit of an organic gardener, really, as far as I can be anyway. And so I like to make sure the soil is fed as far as possible, and I grow enough vegetables to feed a small African country, I think. But I do rather go overboard on it, Linda. It has to be said. So you do need a lot of compost, and I try to use materials that are on the property. So I try not to bring in too much. I might bring in horse manure, for example, but I really would use everything else: lawn clippings, kitchen waste, and those kind of things in my compost as well. So I've got a good source of material. I also have a worm farm. I didn't tell you I have a worm farm. A big worm farm, one of those big magic bins, and that's really interesting as well, because then that gives you lots more material that you can put, both liquid and solid kind, that you can put onto your garden. So so this year it would be fair to say that I have had the best harvest ever. So I'm very pleased with things.
Well, we've just moved our goat house. We've got 5 goats now, so we've built.
What kind of goats?
We've got 2 little baby white Sans. We've got a Toggenburg, and we've got a semi-wild chap. He was found by a ditch as a baby, so he's not wild anymore. And a boar. So we've got a bit of everything.
You have indeed. My mother had a goat farm at one time, just in the Waitakeries, and she had Angora goats, and they were just the most delightful creatures. So I've really got a fondness for goats. So I'm interested that you should have 5 of them. That's a good enough number, because you could get quite lonely if you just have 1 or 2 on their own.
Yeah, I hate seeing goats tethered. It's a horrible thing. They're herd animals, but their pellets are great for the garden, which is what I was when we moved the goat house. All those rotted down pellets. But anyway, that's probably don't need to talk about.
Ideal, absolutely ideal. Yes, and I have availed myself of that particular source from somebody up the road here several times, and it does make things grow really well. Although I do find that you get a lot of grass growing in your garden at the same time.
Yeah. So let's just wrap up with the last couple of questions, Lynnaire. You mentioned you listen to podcasts. What, apart from this one, obviously, what else do you listen to? Have you got your favourites?
I do indeed, and they're a bit of a mix, which is interesting. The Jordan Harbinger show, previously called The Art of Charm, is my absolute favourite because he interviews some really fascinating people, mostly Americans, often people who've written books, people from the military, from the secret services, people from sports arenas, anyone who's got a story to tell about how you can live a better life. And that might be in any kind of different way. It might be emotionally, psychologically, it might be health-wise. He's got a very good interviewing style, Linda, too, and he's very conversational too as well. So I really like him. So he's one. The BBC's The Inquiry, they go in depth into a particular issue once a week from around the world, and I find that fascinating. That kind of takes me away from New Zealand and out into the big wide world. The Daily from the New York Times, I listen to that as I'm going to sleep at night because the new episode just comes in just before midnight, which is interesting. And for my gardening, Living Homegrown, which again is an American podcast about different aspects of having a property like this where you are growing your own food or using it in the kitchen, that kind of thing. And for LinkedIn information, one called Link Informed, I think it's called. A guy who's from England. So, and Mark Williams. And so he writes some really interesting, or has an interesting podcast. He doesn't often have guests. He often just talks himself about the latest things on LinkedIn, the latest innovations. I find that quite interesting too. So you see a wide and eclectic choice there, Linda.
Yes. And that's the good thing about podcasts, isn't it? There's so much. It doesn't all have to be work focused. It can be hobby focused or just whatever grabs your interest.
Well, that's exactly right, yes.
Okay, so what are you currently reading if you're not listening?
Well, I do want to talk briefly about a book that I came across when I was reviewing some books last year, and this is called The 10 Types of Human by a guy called Dexter Diaz. And the subtitle is A New Understanding of Who We Are and Who We Can Be. And I found this book, it's a very big book, Linda, it weighs a ton. And I've read it once and I'm going to read it again because it's so fascinating and there is so much to take in. And the story I want to tell you about this is that the scenario that he paints right at the beginning of the book, which kind of sets the scene, and is this. And my apologies, that is very similar to a particularly awful situation that happened in Florida recently, but this is word for word in the book. If you are a parent and you find that your school, at your school where you have a child, there is a gunman, and you go to the school to try to rescue your child, and you suddenly find yourself faced with three choices. You can save a classroom of 24 children, you can save your child, or you can try to save both and probably save no one. What kind of choice do you make? This is a rhetorical question. I'm not expecting you to come up with an answer. And so what he does from there, he says, okay, so, and generally people will choose, they'll try to save their own child. And he says, okay, well, that's fine. But what happens if the number of children that you could save is 50 or 100? Where do you suddenly go, well, I'm going to sacrifice potentially my child for the good of 50 or 100 others? And that's the kind of dilemma that hopefully we never have to face, but that he talks about in different ways throughout the book. It's rather a book that makes you think about your role in society and where we all fit into the bigger picture. And he visits a number of different countries, talking about a wide number of very delicate issues that can be quite confronting when we live in the paradise that we do and have the freedoms that we do. So I was very taken by it, absolutely, and I recommend it to everyone, called The 10 Types of Human.
It sounds like something to make you think.
Yes, it's not light bedtime reading, let me assure you.
So what's your one piece of advice, Lynnaire? I ask most people on the show, what would that be? It can be on absolutely anything. What would it be?
Right. Well, I think that the best piece of advice that I wish I had followed myself from my early days, Linda, is to keep a journal. Not for any arrogant reasons, but because your memory can be so fallible. And a journal will allow you to remember the lessons that you've learned in life so that you don't have to keep repeating them, keeping making the same mistakes over and over. And I think that over a period of time, it builds up a really good picture of who you are. So, but mostly it's those things I've learned that I wish I hadn't forgotten, that I have to relearn, that I wish that I had been able to keep track of by journaling throughout my life. So that would be the one thing I think that is really important in terms of how we grow and develop.
Yeah, and nice to just look back on, pick one out from 15 years ago and see what you were doing this day 15 years ago. I mean, you've got that sort of thing on Facebook to an extent, but I'm sure your diary, your journal would have a lot more to give.
I think you're absolutely right. And you can write much more personal things in it than you would on Facebook, for example. So I think my approach to that would be writing more about your thoughts, perhaps, and rather than your bacon and babies, so that you can really see how you have developed as a person over the years, or not. But that does require a degree of self-awareness, I think. But people could use it for whatever they want. If they want to use it for bacon and babies, that's fine too. But I think having a record of your life is a really good thing.
So where can people find you, Lynnaire?
I am on LinkedIn, would you believe, Linda? How surprising for me to tell you that. I also have a website at wordwizard.co.nz, and so that's where other people tend to go to find me as well.
Well, Lynnaire, it's been great chatting to you on the show. We've covered an awful lot of ground there, from goat muck to frigates to Japanese car racing to all sorts of things. So
we're doing very well.
Thanks for coming on the show and sharing your stories.
Well, I have had an absolute ball, Linda, so thank you so much for the opportunity.
You've been listening to Tell Us a Story. Why not subscribe or rate us next time you're on iTunes?